starting very close to on time. Absolutely shocking. Welcome, friends, to the Lent Chabad Center. My name is Rabbi Yosef Marcus. I'm delighted that we're able to host all of you for this special presentation this evening. 436 days ago, we experienced the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. We remember it well. We also remember the aftermath, in which the world, instead of empathizing with the victim, blamed the victim. You turned on the news, hoping for something good, but all you heard was another talking head accusing Israel of war crimes, or about how Israel had no strategy and they were just taking revenge. It's a very dark time. Thankfully, now things are a little bit different. Very different. But in all the darkness in that time, there were some glimmers of light. One day, I came across an article, or maybe it was a tweet, of this gentleman who was saying something very different, even radical. He was saying that the IDF is not only innocent of all the libelous claims against it, but that nobody in history has ever done what they are achieving. I immediately assumed that this person was Jewish. I mean, he's so pro-Israel. He's more pro-Israel than AIPAC. But I looked at the name, Spencer. I looked at the picture. It doesn't look Jewish. This is a compliment, by the way. So immediately I added him to my list of people who don't hate us. It's a growing list. I have already 15 people on it. And they're all here today. In the midst of all that darkness, there was a light. A man who was willing to go against the tide, to say what was unpopular, but what was true. Drawing on his expertise as chair of urban studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point, the multiple books that he has written, and the many years that he served as U.S. Army officer, Major John Spencer was able to speak authoritatively with credentials about what the IDF was achieving in Gaza and how they were achieving it. And what he has to say is so important that I feel very blessed that John is with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Major John Spencer.
Thank you for the introduction, Rabbi, and thank you for everybody coming out. I think I'll get a suntan while I'm So I'm going to share with you a little bit of my research. I don't think the clicker's working, so I'll just do old school instructor way of next slide. Of what I've discovered in my research, I'm a researcher. I'm the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute, which is a research center at the United States Military Academy. I've been studying urban warfare for over a decade, going in and out of combat zones from Nagorno-Karabakh to Ukraine to Israel, and had been going to Israel before October 7th, but quickly needed to see it for myself. This is me in Khan Yunis in February of this year. During major operations inside of Gaza, trying to understand the war, but the misinformation started really on October 7th. Next slide.
Try the clicker.
Oh, there you go. Thank you. So, like I said, I'm a combat researcher. I research war. I can't do it unless I'm on the ground. It has been interesting who has tried to say something different than me. They don't know where Gaza is on the map. They haven't, or if they're even an academic, they've never seen the idea, they don't know anything about the idea. I met with the Prime Minister 3 times, I've been to Gaza 4 times, I've been to Northern Israel twice since October 7th. I've done the research so that when I say something, I'm not saying from analyzing TikTok videos, I'm actually on the ground doing interviews. So I was in Israel in December. I had seen the October 7th video in November in a consulate in New York City. I've traveled the world. I did 25 years in military service. I served in 2 combat deployments in Iraq. I've been all around the world in the war zone. I've never seen evil that was conducted on October 7th in video. I still had no idea actually what had happened until I walked the ground to understand the extensiveness of it, that it wasn't a small incursion, it wasn't a terrorist attack, although they were vicious terrorists. It was an invasion of southern Israel, penetrating the barrier wall in over 20 locations and attacking 20 different civilian sites methodically. And I mean levels of military training that I've taught, but beyond that, every site mapped out, intelligence gathered for months, years on every kibbutz, every place that they struck, and locked down with the intention to create as much death and destruction as they could. They had handbooks with them on how to burn people better, to take the tires out of their cars and roll them into the houses. They set up ambushes on all the roads so that nobody could come to anybody's aid. Just the scale of it to this day is still trying to be minimized, and you really can't comprehend it, even geographically, until you've been there and understand that they've spared nothing that they could get to. These maps have a little bit clearer of an idea of how many penetrations of the wall there were, how many direct lines of advance there were onto every one of those sites, and I've walked to many of them, not all of them, but many of them, to understand how methodically they did it. This map is a map of all the places that somebody died or was kidnapped along that path. A complete invasion of southern Israel with that intent to methodically destroy it. But they also had goals, had maps to Dimona, had maps to Tel Aviv, had maps to Jerusalem. They intended to destroy Israel on this day. And that's a bit, again, of the misinformation that any civilian harm was incidental. Like the lies just started immediately when I couldn't have prepared a military force to attack even an enemy base, let alone how they locked down every site and prevented anybody from coming their aid. But Israel fought for southern Israel and took a while to kick them out. And then Israel, as in accordance with all Western law-abiding, international law-abiding forces, Israel declared war against Hamas as a military organization that invaded them and set 3 goals for the war. Return the hostages, above the 250 hostages that Hamas illegally took back into Gaza. Everything from toddlers to Holocaust survivors, men, women, and children back into Gaza. The number 1 goal was to return the hostages. Number 2 was remove Hamas from power, both militarily and politically, as in who's governing Gaza, and to secure the border so that a threat never comes out of Gaza again. Hamas never formally declared its goal of the what they call the Al-Aqsa flood, the attack that they did on October 7th, but they have stated many times, to include since October 7th, their goal of the war is to destroy Israel and the death of all Jews around the world. So when I evaluate as a military strategist, and I've written a bunch of papers since then, as who's winning in Gaza, I had to compare it against those objectives. But in Gaza, the previous map would just show you the geography. Most people here probably know the geography. Gaza is a small area. It's 25 miles long, 5 to 7 miles wide at its longest point. 2.2 million people living in that area. It's highly dense. It's not the densest place on the earth, which is one of the lies that was coming out of the media immediately. I mean, There are mega cities of 10 million. There are places where there's 80 million along the coast. Even the density, there's places in India like Mumbai and other places that are tens of thousands per square mile. It is a highly dense place, though. It's very hard to fight in. But there are other challenges that the IDF, with the goal that they set, which everybody in the world recognized, was just. We have just war theory that, yeah, of course they can start a self-defense war. The only reason really that the United Nations since World War II says you can go to wars in self-defense when you're attacked. Article 51 of the UN Charter. But Israel faced, and this is one of the first articles I wrote, something that no military had faced. These variables. There's no comparison to what Israel faced in Gaza. Number one, the hostages, which we already talked about. Number two, the rockets. So Hamas launched over 4,000 rockets in the opening hour of October 7th. That's more than was launched during the entire Second Lebanon War. And they never stopped launching rockets. So to date, over 13,000 rockets have emanated out of Gaza. So an IDF force fighting against a combatant Hamas and having rockets go over their head, headed towards their home, is unlike any military has ever faced. When you talk about, which I will, the law of war and proportionality, it's qualitative based on the threat. So this is an existential threat, immediate in the rockets, and some people try to compare it against something that where it's not an existential threat, or where the time's not a variable with the hostages. The 2.2 million civilians, some of those being Hamas. Hamas was a military force of over 40,000 on the books, named fighters, arrayed in 24 battalions across the Gaza Strip with identified geographic areas. They're not the only combatants in Gaza, and I have to teach people like Law 101 since October 7th on what is a combatant and what is a non-combatant. In my world, there's no innocent civilians. You're either a non-combatant, protected, you're a civilian, or you're a combatant. If you're a member of Hamas, it doesn't matter if you have a weapon in your hand, in the war scenario, IDF can kill you while you're sleeping. It doesn't matter, you're a member of the combatant force. If you're a civilian though, and you pick up a weapon and shoot at the IDF, you're no longer a civilian, you're a combatant. If you're holding hostages, to include American hostages, you're not a civilian, you're a combatant and can be targeted. But when Israel entered Gaza, thanks to Egypt, which doesn't usually get highlighted in the news, Israel faced something that no military has faced. The entire non-combatant population is trapped in the main combat area since Hamas is arrayed across the entire Gaza Strip. Egypt, despite being a signatory to the African Refugee Convention, said not one Gazan can come into Egypt, into the Sinai Desert. And if you know the geography of Egypt, there's Egypt, and there's the Sinai Desert, and then there's the border between Gaza and Egypt. And they said not one. They built like a 30-foot wall. They deployed an armor unit there with tanks to make sure nobody came from Gaza into Egypt. The IDF then faced a war with the combatants, with a non-combatant population that had nowhere to go, and they had to create somewhere for them to go. And they created a humanitarian zone within Gaza. But nobody's really faced that in a war before. The tunnels, I don't have time to talk to tunnels. I just released a big report. It took me a year to write. What we thought I've been doing tunnel conferences in Israel for years, studying underground warfare, what I do as well. 300 to 400 miles of tunnels in Gaza, ranging from just underneath the surface of almost every building to over 200 feet underground. Over $1 billion of investment, most of them concrete, steel reinforced tunnels, bigger than the New York Metro, the Seoul Metro, or the London Metro. Just an underground city in Gaza. People have faced tunnels in war before, but nothing like that. I used to say before visiting, like in Khan Yunis, the photo I showed you earlier, where I was standing on top of a tunnel, basically every step that the IDF takes in Gaza, it's more likely that there's a tunnel underneath you than there's not. But I used to say that Hamas put a tunnel underneath every hospital, every school, every mosque, and they did that. But what I found out is no, they built the tunnel and then put the school on top of it. Because they built a world for war. When Israel withdrew from 2005, although there were tunnels in Gaza when Israel was there, but Israel completely withdrew from Gaza, and it was left to Hamas, and for the next 17 years, they built their world for war. And lastly, so the tunnel networks, and I could go on for long, I could do a whole lecture on tunnels, on how the IDF dealt with the tunnels, to where the IDF have transformed their approach to tunnels. Even the IDF had an approach of don't go in a tunnel unless you have to. Over the war and dealing with Hamas, using the tunnels to just buy time. Because if I didn't mention it, Hamas's strategy is clear, but to win the war, all they have to do is survive. It doesn't matter if most of them die. If they survive the war and take power in Gaza, in my definition, then they've won. That's war, a strategy. They did this attack, the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and survived as an organization, and now have, they paid a big price, but they own Gaza still. That would be a victory. Their tunnels is the main objective. This is the first war I've ever studied where the underground is more important than the surface. Because the tunnels are where the hostages were. The tunnels are where Hamas was. The tunnels are where Hamas's leadership was. Don't go to Rafah. They're in the tunnels in Rafah. Don't go to the Philadelphia quarter between Egypt and Gaza, which is that border that I was telling you about between Egypt and Gaza. And they found over 100 tunnels leading from Egypt into Gaza, and it was the bloodline for Hamas to survive as an organization. All of this is different than everything else I've studied. I've studied everything from the Battle of Troy, Athens, and Sparta, through World War I and World War II, to the Middle East, to battles I've been involved with till now. Nobody's faced this. And lastly, when nobody faces a human shield strategy that everybody's faced. Hamas is a terrorist organization that uses its population as a shield against attack. So they'll fire a rocket from a school, and knowing that the IDF will follow the law of war and go through the protocol before they strike it. But Hamas, and Al-Qaeda did that, ISIS does that. The major battles that I'll tell you about, we fought combatants who did that human shield strategy. But Hamas, unlike others, does a human sacrifice strategy. Where in order to achieve their political goal of the war and for their grand strategy, they need as many of their population to die as possible. And they will do everything physically possible to get them killed, to include killing them themselves, to achieve their goal in the afterlife, in this fundamental afterlife of their ideology. That's unique. The Japanese didn't do that, the Nazis didn't do that, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, nobody said, I need all my people to die to achieve my goal. All 2.2 million of the Gazans could fit in Hamas's 400 miles of tunnels with ease and escape all of the effects of the war. But not one has been allowed in it, except for the late Yahya Sinwar's wife and children. Those are the only civilians that have ever been allowed in their tunnels. So these conditions all add up to when I wrote, stop comparing Gaza to anything else that's come before it, because there is no comparison. Immediately, people started comparing these to the global war on terrorism. A few of the big battles I'll tell you about that were single battles. There's 24 cities in Gaza. There's 10 cities over 100,000. Gaza City is 600,000. But they were, like the News, New York Times, and others were comparing Gaza's numbers to like the Battle of Mosul, which is one battle of a city, or Fallujah, one battle for a city. There's 10 cities here. And in my world, there's 3 types of lies. Lies, damn lies, and statistics. I can make the number say whatever I want it to say. It's just the way I aggregate, disaggregate, gerrymander, whatever you want to call it. Next slide. But I also faced the law of war, right? So immediately, the number one thing I saw being lied about Israel's actions in the war in general, and it's still going on today, is what we call lawfare, weaponizing the law of war, making it say what it doesn't say. They're trying to redefine the definition of genocide right now. Very problematic. But I faced this on October 8th when people were talking proportionality. People, they just don't know what the law of war means. They said, well, only 1,200 people were raped, murdered, beheaded, burned on October 7th, so you can only kill 1,200 in your war against Hamas. That has nothing to do with it. The law of war is never quantitative. And the law of proportionality, although all of these are important, is the one, next slide, that was getting abused and still is abused to this day. It's almost like the war on drugs. Like I teach war. You stop using that word. It has a very specific meaning. It's the pursuit of political goals, the use of force, or the threat of use of force. But proportionality means I can use the appropriate amount of force to achieve the concrete military objective I'm trying to achieve, and taking every feasible and reasonable step to limit the collateral damage. That can be done by an individual strike. So if there's a really high person in the military that I'm fighting, and he's a high-level person, I use a proportionate amount of force, whether it's a bomb or a missile, to kill that person, and I calculate, will there be any collateral damage, or what's the value of that person in general to the military mission? But it can also be for an operation. You can use the proportionate amount of force to achieve your goal to defend your nation from invasion. And this gets brought out, but it's never quantitative, although we'll talk about where the numbers come from. It's qualitative, and it's designed and evolved across time. And there have been new laws that have evolved, and we call customary laws and things like that. But immediately, just the masses, which the court of public opinion has always mattered. Because war is a contest of wills between not just two militaries. It's not just between the IDF and Hamas, as you know. War is a contest of wills between two governments, two populations. It's called a clausus trinity, but also has an international context. You can lose a war. You can win every battle, but lose every war. You lose the will of the population for the goals that your nation is pursuing. Or if they think you're doing something that you're not, which is the case with Israel. Next slide. So when I said proportionality is you use the proportionate amount of force to achieve your goal against a concrete military objective, and then take every reasonable and feasible, it's called the law of precaution, step to prevent or lower this collateral damage. There is no such thing as a zero collateral damage, zero civilian casualties, zero in a war. There would just be no war. But Israel, and this is the other statement I made with, people can have their own opinions, but they can't have their own facts. Israel has done more to prevent civilian harm, casualties, death, than any military in the history of war. Because I know what any military has ever done in any like situation where there are civilians trapped in an urban environment, or there's civilians at all. Usually, you stop, you give warning, and you allow civilians to get out of harm's way. You can do that usually by dropping flyers. We've all done this. All Western militaries actually follow the law of war. We're not talking about the case studies of, if you want to do comparative analysis, but what did so-and-so do in this case that wasn't compared to this? Or this case that wasn't like this, but what did they do? Most people will drop flyers, although, which I've argued as well, is that giving time for the civilians to get out of harm's way doesn't necessarily lead to less civilian harm. The way you win wars is with overwhelming force, speed, and surprise. Look at the way that we invade Iraq, Afghanistan, Panama, the way that Russia tried to invade Ukraine. You don't tell them you're coming, and then they get ready. You invade quickly. But Israel waited after October 7th, 3 weeks, and immediately notified civilians in northern Gaza, over 1 million, please evacuate to southern Gaza and get out of harm's way. And the international community immediately said, you can't do that. Literally, that was the message. Like, what do you mean you can't do that? Like, that's the right thing to do. And they drop flyers, which is what everybody else did. But then Israel does, because it is a startup nation, technologically advanced, started calling everybody. No military's ever done that. I don't have the phone numbers. I don't know who to call. Israel put more soldiers in this room, and every day, all day, called into Gaza saying, is this so-and-so? You're in this area. Please evacuate to this area. Take this road. Millions of phone calls. And those numbers are old numbers. Millions of voicemails. Millions of texts. They put speakers on drones and flew them into areas. They started handing out their maps. So as the world said, well, that's not good enough. Although there's a certain percentage of civilians that just refuse to leave, and we can talk about what's happened in northern Gaza since then. Israel, in 3 weeks, successfully evacuated 85 to 90% of northern Gaza before they started any ground invasion. Yes, they started an air campaign because, oh, by the way, there were still rockets, thousands, hundreds a day emanating out of Gaza. So they bombed those sites. I haven't written this yet, but the generals already answered it. What would the United States have done on October 8th? We would have launched overwhelming combat power into enemy territory and bombed it until not one rocket emanated out of the enemy territory. That's just war. Israel evacuated all these civilians, and the world was like, that's not good enough. So Israel started handing out its maps, and that's a picture of the maps they started handing out there. They were doing daily pauses from day one that they started the war. Nobody else has done that. And just hundreds of days with it. Every day they would stop for 4 hours saying, look, for these 4 hours, we will not conduct any military operations so that civilians can leave along this road and go to this area. It was also sending a signal to Hamas. I can't imagine that somebody who teaches the only course at the division level, actually teaching here in California once a year, that you're telling your enemy and giving the enemy your map and saying, every day I'll be here, just so you know. Civilians don't come here, but where do you think Hamas is going to go? Every day. That still wasn't good enough. The world said, well, the civilian casualty is too high. What do you mean it's too high? How does that work in war? You cannot deny that fact that Israel has done more. Israel started, I mean, the list goes on of what Israel has done to prevent civilian casualties. They started tracking civilians in real time by their cell phones, whether they're on or off. It could tell you in every 3-block area how many civilians were in that area, and they would not go in that area, no matter what was going on in that area, until it was evacuated. Because during the first temporary ceasefire that Hamas did because it was under military pressure, Hamas, nobody reported it, sent hundreds of thousands of civilians into areas that they didn't live, just because they knew when the ceasefire stopped that it would cause more problems for the idea. They increased the population of Khan Yunis, where I was, by 300% during the ceasefire. But they've done more. Okay, so John Spencer, a smart guy, how does that compare against anybody else? Well, if there hasn't been another case, it's really hard to give you a comparative analysis. I have one, which is when I first met with the Prime Minister, I told him about nobody in the United States was talking about it, and nobody in Israel knew about it. In 1945, at the Battle of Manila, we had been kicked out of the Philippines during World War II. We regained combat power. We went back. General MacArthur hits the beach and famously says, go to Manila and get our people. Because in the city of Manila, which is a city of about 1 million, there were 4,000 American, British, and a couple other country POWs we had left behind, but also their families and workers called internees. So 4,000 hostages were in the city being held by 17,000 Japanese defenders, which is still less than Hamas, right? Hamas is 40,000 plus all the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, all the Lions Den, all the civilians who turned themselves into combatants. But MacArthur did not want the city destroyed. So one of the things I didn't mention was that Gaza, I did mention it, but I think it fails for somebody who doesn't study urban warfare for a living, is that Hamas had prepared Gaza for war for 15 years, had prepared it to defend it. Most urban battles of military history, from Stalingrad to you name it, the defender has had a very little amount of time to prepare to defend it. And that matters on how the battle will go. Like how much defensive prep you give me a year, I could turn Los Angeles into a really hard problem. That's because I know what I'm doing. The Japanese only had a few months that actually decided at the last minute to defend it. So 17,000 defenders. General MacArthur loved Manila. He was served there, his father served there. He said, do not destroy Manila. You get no air power. The U.S. military attack, which is a theory, people think that if you just bomb a place less, there'll be less destruction. I actually believe the opposite in my studies, that if you don't have the tools to take an enemy out of the building, then he'll just turn that building into a really protracted, month-long battle for you, and that's historical as well. So MacArthur said no air power. We attacked with about 27,000 forces against 17,000 Japanese defenders. We got all of our hostages home, but 100,000 civilians died in this battle. Now, some people have argued that number, but that's the historical number. What's also revealing is that number, 100, it wasn't a major news story. 100,000 civilians died. And of those 100,000, the Japanese killed many of those. They were just slaughtering civilians and stacking them in the basements because they didn't care about the Philippine civilians. Well, some people will say, well, John Spencer, that was World War II. We used to do awful things. We killed 180,000 Japanese in one night in bombing in Tokyo. We killed 300,000 in a bombing campaign, firebombing of Tokyo, before we dropped the nuclear bomb. All of these things were before the Forced Geneva Convention. So after that, we said we would not bomb civilian populations trying to get them to convince their political leaders to stop the war. So we said we wouldn't do that. So John stopped using the Battle of Manila, although there was no bombing in the Battle of Manila. So then post-Geneva Conventions, there's the Battle of Seoul, which in my world, the Incheon landing, the Korean War, a really big maneuver, but the forces were headed to the city of Seoul, which had 14,000 North Korean defenders. We attacked with more, and these numbers mean a lot to me because you don't attack a defense with the same amount of forces that are defending, because they have an advantage. You use way more overwhelming force. But we attacked with about 40,000 against those 7,000 defenders. There's no record of how many civilians died. Not one, and I've looked really hard. Because this thing, which you've probably heard of, is, yeah, but what's your civilian to combatant ratio? That's never been asked of a country in a war before. That's an Israeli question. I don't want that being asked of any other person's war because there's lots of problematic, well, how do you get the number? Does the number mean that I'm not following the law of war, not doing everything possible? Who's killing civilians? Like, that number is so awful to become the determinant of whether somebody's following the laws of war, which, if you were even following, I can't give you a Russian comparison because Russia doesn't follow the law of war. Syria didn't follow when it killed 500,000 people in its war, Syrian civil war, which is evolving now. So the one other battle, so there's two battles that the Americans partook, really in the last 20 years. One is the Second Battle of Fallujah against a small 3,000 forces. It's the biggest battle in the entire Iraq War. This little battle against 3,000 defenders in a city of 400,000. I was involved in the invasion. The Battle of Baghdad, 6 million people live in Baghdad. Why is this little city fight in Fallujah bigger than all other battles? It's because the defenders were given the city and told that basically it's yours and had time to defend it, so it caused this massive battle. That's what happened in the 2016 to 17 Battle of Mosul. ISIS had taken many cities, but this is the capital of the caliphate. The Iraq government had allowed them to hold it for 2 years. And for 2 years, they did a really good job on trying to prepare to defend it. 3 layers of defensive belts. They had dug some tunnels, but nothing compared to what the cities that Hamas built. The Iraqi military used 100,000 security forces. That's right, 100,000. And it took them 9 months to get 3,000 to 5,000 defenders out of the city. 10,000 civilians died to get 3,000 to 5,000. Actually, there's no number of how many combatants died. There's only the number of the civilians that died. And a year after this battle, because I was tracking it, it's my job, the Iraqi government's like, well, we don't know. Well, we think it's about 40,000 civilians that died. And through different methodologies, the United Nations and others came in and said, well, we think it's 11,000, based on consensus and other things, which I've lived there. That's really hard to do in Iraq. What they also don't say is that the Iraqi military that did this operation lost 10,000 soldiers. That's what happens when you let an enemy take a city and control it. So what is the number in Gaza? This is the number that everybody was talking about, to include national leaders of countries, to include our own. But what's the civilian casualty count? One is that recognizing nobody asked who the number, there's actually, I'll show you the next slide, but I'll go through the numbers real quick. That's the Gaza Health Ministry, which is the Hamas Gaza Health Ministry's numbers. Right? That's not me being flippant. That's me. I'm not Jewish. I'm not Israeli. I'm pro-truth. I'm a researcher. That number comes from Hamas. You didn't live in you definitely didn't work in Gaza unless you were a member of Hamas, a political organization. Independent, we could argue on your ideology, but you were Hamas, the Hamas Gaza Health Ministry. Immediately started coming up with a number, which is actually historic. I don't have time to go into it, but the world ate it up. All they did was report daily. There's never been an urban battle, let alone an urban war, where anybody, to include the United States or anybody, let alone a terrorist organization, who's been able to track the civilian deaths every day down to the single digit. How did Gaza do it? I mean, that's magic. There's some reports on how they do it. They started off with this computer system that counted bodies and registered bodies. That went out in November. So then they started doing credible media reports of deaths. Nobody knows what that is. A lot of it was social media. So if they saw a social media report about somebody being missing, that went on the list. Then they started doing family reports. So they opened a Google Share Drive and then report your martyr's name here and put somebody's name on the list. The list is a lie. I'm not saying a lot of civilians haven't died in Hamas's work, because I just told you about Hamas is trying to get them killed. Of those 13,000 plus rockets that Hamas and others have launched at Israel, every one of them are war crime because they cannot determine where they go. They just spray and pray, as we say. They're launching them at Israel. 20% of those have landed inside of Gaza, killing Gazans. But the list, the by name list, this is where I don't do colleges, but if I did, I would tell them, you just keep making up numbers that even Hamas doesn't say. Like 17,000 women and with children dead. Like, that's not how many children are on Hamas's list. And their list is really problematic. Every time that the list comes out, people get younger. It's weird. There's people who have died of natural causes. I don't know the extent of it because, again, this list is crazy. But the world stopped using the caveats of even Hamas, Gaza Health Ministry. And then they start saying, well, the UN believes that these are valid. Like, what? So it took Israel, and we can be judgmental. It took Israel like 6-7 months before they came out with the number of combatants they've killed. Through combat reports, through targeting. And they say they've killed anywhere from 17 to 22,000 combatants. It's 22,000. I was just there 2 weeks ago, but we'll go with 17,000. If you took the numbers that everybody has, I would really not like to take a terrorist organization's number. And I know you can't have one in real time, and I don't want somebody asking anybody, what's your civilian to combatant ratio? No, I want to know if they're following the laws of war. And I've been on the ground, and I can tell you they're taking more caution than anybody has ever done. And putting themselves at risk more than anybody else has done. Not because they have to, but because that's the spirit of the IDF. Their legal, moral, ethical code that they follow. But if you took these numbers, it would still be, and again, this is where the lies, damn lies, and statistics. Before this war, the United Nations was not true, but saying that the casualties of the casualties of modern wars that happen in urban areas, 90% of them are civilians. That's their number. They were using it all over the place. Now, I was arguing against it then, but if they're going to use it, I'll use it. That would be like a 1-to-9 combatant to civilian ratio. But if you look at the numbers, every one of them, Israel would still, if the numbers were true, which they're not, have a lower civilian to combatant ratio. So, but next slide. This just came out a couple of days ago, a statistical analysis of where does the world's media get their numbers. 98% of them took Hamas's number without question. BBC, New York Times, you name them, all of them. And 3 to 5% would ever even mention the IDF's number. That's pretty damning. And I'm as objective as possible. Next slide. So where are we today? I try to give a highlight of, because the war's evolved, and we could go through all the transitions of when they were told, don't go to Rafah, don't do this, don't use a 2,000-pound bomb, because what penetrates the earth to get to somebody in the bunker really well, 5 to 2,000-pound bombs. And that's where the enemy was. But they told them you couldn't have it, and the United States started withholding it because of, I knew where the genesis of that lie came from, because I've been fighting people who believe there should be no bombs in war. No, literally, there's an initiative. I fought in the United Nations in Vienna. There's an initiative called the Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas. Massive, powerful human rights groups who believe that us military should fight our wars in urban areas if we have to, get all the civilians 100% out, but you still don't get a bomb, a missile, a mortar, nothing. You just should find a way to do it without it. And that's where the use of 2,000-pound bombs, to include lies about how many times it's been used in history. We used 15,000 in the first Gulf War. We used 5,000 in the opening days of the invasion of Iraq. This is what it looks like now, as the IDF had to, because of the fact that they were in a seven-front war. The IDF attacked with about 4 divisions. It's almost a 1-to-1 ratio, attacker to defender. I told you 100,000 Iraqi security forces had a challenge getting 3,000, although the IDF aren't the Iraqi military. They have methodically, discriminately, not. So all of these protests out there and all their lies, they haven't been effective. Hamas, 24 battalions, broken. There's only one battalion existing today, and it's existing because it's inside of the humanitarian zone that was set up along the beach, because that's the only area in which Hamas didn't have tunnels, where they created the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone. Israel has methodically cleared and broken the Hamas military, destroyed its rocket supplies, killed its leadership. It's a guerrilla force, but the job isn't done. Israel has created new corridors throughout Gaza, which will help keep a security presence and project security power so nothing threatens Israel. But some of the numbers, and I'll talk about the north really quickly before we go into questions, is that most of southern Israel is repopulated. Because that was Israel's challenge. It was, of course, defeat the enemy, bring the hostages home. It was also restore a sense of security in the Israeli people. Being attacked every day, because on October 8th, Hezbollah attacked and joined the war. Next slide. And I mean, the numbers on the 1.1 million tons or 2.2 thousand million pounds of aid, the number of aids, I don't have time to go into it, but also the historic level of during a war. Yes, if I went to World War II and talked about after the war, Germany unilaterally surrendered. We could talk about the Marshall Plan and aid, but during a war, Israel has done more to feed the enemy's population than any military in the history of war. But the genesis of all the lies just kept on going with using what numbers? From the ICC, the ICJ, but I can tell you as an objective observer, researcher, been on the ground, there is no genocide in Gaza. There is suffering for sure. And Hamas is doing everything it can as a criminal guerrilla group that it is now to keep suffering down. What Israel has done to repair water pipes, to create field hospitals, to evacuate people that need medical care, it's historic. I used to say, I was trying to write it, that Gaza is where the truth goes to die. And there's a little acronym. Military people like to make acronyms because they said that Israel was being disproportionate. They didn't know what proportionality meant. They said that Israel was being indiscriminate, trying to count the number of bombs, which ones are precision guided, which ones aren't. Indiscriminate means they don't know what they're shooting at. No, they know that Hamas that they're shooting at. And E was the excessive, that they were being excessive. Compared to what? To achieving their goal? No. This is the one example that should have caused a caveat, but it's one of thousands of examples. I know some people in the room remember it, but I think it's worth reminding people what happened in November of 2023 when the world said Israel had bombed the hospital. Although I wrote an article about the U.S. military bombing hospitals. And hospitals can't be no-go areas, or that's where all the terrorists will go, and nobody will be safe. No patient will be safe. Hospitals are unique. The building is protected, the staff is protected, the wounded is protected, and Hamas used that. But this report came out that Israel had bombed a hospital. Even I was watching it, and I do a lot of X and social media. I was on social media, and hundreds dead, Israel bombs a hospital. Israel didn't say anything. They needed a report. within hours, the number kept climbing. 500 dead, 900 dead. And this is a picture here, which some people saw. I actually cropped it because I have some decency and I have children, where the Gaza Health Ministry emptied the morgue of the Al-Ali hospital, took all the dead bodies out and put them in the parking lot to include people holding dead children, and had a conference just like this. Gaza Health Ministry, the one that everybody's numbers they used, said Israel bombed the hospital's gone, 900 dead, and had all these dead people around them. Of course, when they don't care, but hours later when the sun comes up, there's a pothole in the parking lot where a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket had exploded in the parking lot, and none of these news organizations retracted those numbers. That's just one example of 1,000 where Israel has been accused of things in Israel. Next slide. So I didn't want to end it without a positive. So a positive is, no matter what the lies have said, Israel has continued. It went to Rafah. It has brought the hostages, over half of the hostages home. It's probably going to enter another temporary deal with Hamas to bring more hostages home. Hamas is much weaker than it was, especially at the fall of Hezbollah, who joined, although they're no friend of Hamas, but joined supposedly because of Hamas's struggle, and launched tens of thousands of rockets. The numbers are up there, and 60 to 80,000 Israelis homeless for over a year. I'd see them every time I go to visit. And eventually Israel decided that it tried for 12 months a political solution because the world was saying, you've got to find a diplomatic solution to the guy bombing you every day. And they did that. But eventually, especially when Hamas killed a bunch of Jewish children in northern Israel, they decided, we've tried everything. They launched the most impressive military campaign that I've ever seen in my lifetime, and historically, to include the terrorist organization ordering itself new pagers, and Israel inserting a paper-thin explosive that nobody even knew was possible, and in the most discriminate, impressive intelligence operation in history, rivaling like D-Day invasion, breaking the Enigma, exploded these pagers across the Hezbollah formation, across the geographic area from Lebanon to Syria to other places, simultaneously identifying who's in Hezbollah, because these are terrorist pagers ordered for terrorists, distributed to top terrorists, exploding them all at once, revealing terrorists. As a matter of fact, the terrorists said, stop taking pictures of people that are wounded because it's revealing who's terrorists. Then the next day, the walkie-talkies blow up. But then, next slide. Israel engaged in a targeted military attack campaign that eliminated every Hezbollah leader in that organization. And if the new one said, I'm the new boss, he would die. As a matter of fact, I'm surprised the new guy just recently said how much they won in the war, I guess. But not only did they do this impressive intelligence operation, they eliminated the entire hierarchy. You do not replace that quickly. It takes decades. Hasrallah and Nasrallah, the list goes on. But they were also doing all the work that would be needed. Everybody said that Israel would sacrifice thousands of soldiers entering northern or southern Lebanon because of the 2006 Lebanon war, of the scale of Hezbollah. Hezbollah was a massive army, over 100,000 fighters with 100,000 rockets that could rain down. In a matter of 2 weeks, the IDF and Israel did this, eliminated 60 to 80% of Hezbollah's rocket supplies, its supply routes. And I was in 2 weeks ago in northern Israel, and one thing I didn't see in southern Lebanon was Hezbollah. And one thing I did see in northern Israel was people coming back home. And even the IDF, we've never seen this, just the life. Even though it hasn't been nobody's been told to come back, Israelis will do Israeli things. The life is coming back. And a lot of work still to be done in Gaza. In order for Israel to not allow Hamas to regain power, to bring the hostages home, you have to continue operations. But what was done against Hezbollah, where Hezbollah's crying uncle at this point because they're not fighting anymore, they're just losing. and Israel has created a real buffer and renegotiated something that the United Nations, and I actually was 2 weeks ago looking down at UNIFIL, which is United Forces in Lebanon, which has meant our dollars, US dollars, millions of dollars for a decade, was meant for 18,000 UNIFIL soldiers to keep Hezbollah out of this area where massive stockpiles. They had a bunker ready to go to do October 7th on the Galilee. Mopeds, GoPros, weapons, to do October 7th on northern Israel. I was looking down on the UNIFIL headquarters. It's a massive complex on the beachside property. That's a part of the UN story that needs to be addressed. I don't have time to go into it. I wanted to leave on a good note, because despite the lies, I personally believe as an objective observer, Israel is safer today than it was on October 6th. The Islamic regime in Iran, we also, maybe we'll talk about in questions, its tentacles have been severed. Its plan for the Middle East are upended. All of its proxies weakened. Syria has fallen because of Israel's operation to defend itself. Its weaknesses have been exposed. There's still a lot of work to be done, and I'm hopeful what the new U.S. administration will do towards the Islamic regime in Iran. That's the head of the snake. But what Israel has done has made Israel stronger than it was on October 6th. It also exposes its weakness. War exposes your weakness. And there are things that Israel had become complacent on that it'll never, in a generation, ever do again. But it's stronger today than it was on October 6th. So with that, Dave, I think me and David are going to have to talk about some questions.
John, that was incredible. As someone who reads the news from Israel every single day, except on Shabbat, I learned so much, and I'm sure we've all learned so much from you, and we could probably be here all night listening to you. Before we go to our question and answers, which are going to be moderated, so, it's a hot topic, so all the questions have already been received, and David will be presenting them. I'll get out of the way here. I just want to welcome some elected officials and leaders that are here today from our San Mateo City Council. Your name is here somewhere. We have also from the mayor of Los Altos, Pete Daly, who is here, as well as leaders in the Chinese community and the Hindu community. And I want to thank Karen Orr and Gili for bringing them here and inviting them. And we hope that this presentation, not only a great boost of confidence for us as Jews, and also the optimistic and positive note that John left us with, which is also something I've never heard, that other peoples in our community who can be allies for us outside of the Jewish community. We thank you for being here, and thank you, John, for the incredible presentation. We're now going to have the Q&A. I'll introduce our moderator, David Rudnitsky. He's the founder of 3Q Digital and a major macher in the Jewish community at Warnick Jewish Day School, here at Chabad, and in general in the Bay Area. Ladies and gentlemen, our Q&A.
Thank you, John. That was great. A lot of questions came in before the session, so I'll try to get through as many as we can, but I think to get through all of them, we need about 3 days. So
I tried to answer them all in the presentation, so I'd mess with it.
You did pretty good. All right. First question, I want to ask about the U.S. political landscape. I think the question is that there was recently a vote in the Senate to block arms to Israel, and the question is, did you talk to any of those senators? And generally speaking, how are politicians using you as a resource in the United States?
That's a good question. So no, I did not talk to any of those senators. I would love to. Because I also asked where people can get their information. And I have talked to some congressmen, not senators, especially not the ones that are so vocal like college student. In my opinion, and I stay apolitical, useful idiots on where they're getting their information and parroting the numbers of Hamas. Not validated, shown to be methodologically, just lies. Nope, haven't been used or called for that. I mean, I got a little attention when the Prime Minister of Israel mentioned my name to the U.S. Bipartisan in the whole U.S. Congress House, but not like people would think of. Like, where are you getting your information? You're so convinced of that you're voting in that way.
Is that different than in other instances of urban warfare? I mean, have you been frequently a source for these congressmen and senators, and you're just not now? Or are they always just looking for information elsewhere?
So, again, I don't run to the Capitol, but I will say, because I was doing research in Ukraine, so I did 4 visits in Ukraine, writing about the Battle of Kyiv and most of the urban battles. I was doing 20 interviews a day in mainstream media about Ukraine. When Israel-Gaza, I started doing about 10 a day. Once I got viewed as some type of pro-Israel, I did 0 a day. And you haven't seen me on mainstream media for a while, outside of News Nation, Chris Cuomo, great guy. He'll push back a little. I've done one CNN interview in the last year, and it's when Dan Escudo wanted to argue and try to bring all the experts he could to argue against me, and it made him look really bad.
I guess on a related point, have you faced any criticism or pushback for telling the truth about this war?
Absolutely. And I don't want to get ahead of it, but the New York Times has, for about 6 months, dug into my complete life, interviewing anybody I've ever served with, worked for, researched with, everything, trying to find that angle. Like, why is he telling the truth? Why is he being used by Israel objectively? And when I go there, they're like, how do you get access? Because I've been studying Israel for a while. Why do you say these things? Because they're true. There's a hit piece coming. I'm an open book. I'm not worried about it. There's been a few academics who have had the chutzpah to try to write something in contention of me. But again, these aren't my opinions. I had 10 years of work. So you want to compare the Battle of Mosul. You want to compare how many people dropped the bomb. You want to know what the law says. There has been people who have said that John Smith, he doesn't know what he's talking about. The urban warfare guy who's been studying urban warfare for a decade. But they just don't have a leg to stand on. So outside of that, I mean, of course, I don't need to do the interviews. I got lots of work to do. There's been a lot of hate, death threats, all that stuff, but you didn't ask the question, it wasn't on your list, like, why do I do this?
Yeah.
Usually it's one of the first questions, because I'm not Israeli, I'm not Jewish. Yes, I have Israeli friends, but I was brought up in the U.S. military to have character, that there is the truth, and that you should stand to be counted. With great knowledge comes great responsibility. I had the knowledge. How could I not say the truth on all the lies that started? And I've seen evil around the world. I've never seen an evil like Hamas. And I did have friends in Israel, and they were killing my friends. So a long list of reasons, but why do I need a reason to fight for the truth? And that's what I tell people. And if they vilify me for telling the truth, vilify my analysis. And it's how many people who haven't stood up for the truth is the right question.
I guess I'd like to hear your perspective of the IDF. I mean, I know you think very favorably of them, but you have studied militaries around the world. How does the IDF differ or is similar to the U.S. military and other militaries?
A lot of differences. That was one of my first challenges in studying the IDF. I've studied everything from, the the 1967 Battle of Jerusalem, Suez City in 73, Jenin, Nablus. I had to understand what the IDF is. And people have this misconception, again, people that are too lazy to do the work. Like, what is it? Is it a conscript military? No, it's a nation's military. The nation defends itself only in war. It, though, is, of a Western democratic nation, those militaries are a reflection of society. The IDF is a reflection of the IDF society. That's what we call ethical, because you have the legal, which is, do they follow all the laws of war? Absolutely. They go above and beyond the legal requirements. In Gaza, in Lebanon, you name it. Some of that's because, and people say, well, this is an Israeli standard, and I agree. But that's not why the IDF do what they do, because they have to follow this legal, because you do have to have allies. And Israel is a small country in a really bad neighborhood. It needs allies, and I'm proud as an American that the United States, at the beginning of October 7th, and yes, there are lots of political decisions made, but on October 8th, the United States says Israel has had to stand alone, and it will never have to again. Some of that got put to the test, and Israel's had to make decisions on its own, and it has, and sitting with the Prime Minister and talking through those decisions when he had to go it alone, and was willing to protect the nation of Israel. But the military has that legal, of course it follows all the legal things in any Western military, that has that spirit of the IDF. It's like its ethical code, like this is who we are. And I've seen other militaries, like I was in Ukraine and saw what the Russian military did to Ukrainian civilians, tying their hands behind the back, shoot them in the back of the head. That upset me as a soldier, like that's not what soldiers do, because we have the legal part, we have this ethical code. I won't say, I know my friend Richard Kemp will say the most moral military on the earth. It's one of the most moral militaries on the earth, along with other Western militaries that follow and have a ethical code of reflection of their society. If you've ever been to Israel, which most of the people that wage these libels have never been, you know how inclusive it is, how peaceful it is. It's amazing, but a lot of understanding the IDF in this context, and that's why I wanted to go watch them in operations. You can tell me, even what I knew about the IDF before October 7th doesn't matter, because people thought the IDF was seeking revenge. Every soldier, and I've interviewed everybody from the chief of the IDF, Division Southern Command Commander, Division Commanders, down to individual soldiers. I've never gotten that from the IDF. They have a mission. They're following the mission to destroy Hamas, separating the civilians. They don't like to see innocents harmed, just like a normal soldier doesn't. That's why every feeling that I've gotten watching them in operation, not what somebody's telling me. Some people think that I'm just they have nice names for me, a shield or whatever, that I'm only seeing what the IDF want me to see. Like, no, I go in and I observe them in operations, and everything is moral, ethical, trying to protect, but also aggressively trying to destroy the enemy, just like I would.
Yeah, I will say that my wife and I visited the Urban Warfare Center. I can't remember the name of it.
Saline,
which is a full city that was built by the U.S. and Israel to replicate.
Absolutely.
Urban warfare, and we talked to a soldier, and I said, "What's the difference between being in this place and in Gaza?" And I thought they were going to say the speed of war, the danger. They said, "No, it's really hard to go into someone's house and realize that someone's trying to live their life and do your job."
Absolutely.
It was amazing.
Yeah. I'm not saying the soldiers don't do the wrong thing. That's the thing. Like I served for 25 years. I had soldiers do the wrong thing. An ethical professional military holds soldiers accountable who violate not even the law, but their own ethical. I've seen Israel do that, and we've seen Israel do that. That's a part of being a professional ethical military.
One question that's related to this, and I guess we'll ask you as an expert and also as a non-member of the tribe. The question comes from Erez, who served, was deployed with the IDF in Gaza in 1999. He's here today. His question is, why is Israel, and specifically the IDF, expected to prioritize measures like humanitarian aid and roof knocking, even at the cost of soldiers' lives? And is there a double standard even when compared to the U.S. and other Western militaries that's applied to Israel?
Yeah, it's a great question coming from a soldier. One, I don't think it's a double standard, because that would mean that there's a known standard, and you're asking Israel to follow almost addition to it. This is an Israeli standard. And right, he talked about roof knocking, which Israel was doing after October 7th. I knew about roof knocking from previous wars, like 2008, 2014 war in Gaza, where they'll call a building before they strike it, going, "This is a enemy, a military building. Please evacuate." They'll call everybody. They'll give them time. If they don't, they'll drop non-penetrating explosives on the roof. They knock on the roof. We really mean it. Please evacuate the building. And then after a certain amount of time, they'll strike the building. It's an Israeli standard, which I wish wasn't there. But I also understand, as a professor who used to teach, an instructor of war, I taught strategy. Like, there's always an international context. The U.S. military lost the first battle of Fallujah because, really interesting, Al Jazeera was sitting in the hospital airing photos of dead children and coming up with false numbers of civilian casualties. It was a mini Gaza in the first battle of Fallujah, and we were defeated 6 days in the battle, and we left because the Iraqi government said they would disband because of this misinformation. It's always there. That's why I'm so impressed by the idea that despite the international context in which Israel has to fight a war, I was on a panel in the United Nations with Alan Dershowitz and a couple other people, and it's like, Israel needs to go it alone, not rely on any American support. That's not realistic. Israel's strength, just like the strength of any nation, is its allies. And yes, the Americans, again, would have done October 7th differently and would have continued it differently because we, like the first battle of Fallujah, still have an international context. Israel's strength is its allies, and the fact that you had Arab nations, which they don't really talk about, defending Israel when Iran attacked with cruise and ballistic missiles, when you had Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and others helping defend Israel, that's a moment of Israeli strength. It has formed peace agreements, alliances, personal relationships. That's important. So I don't like that Israel's held to this standard. I recognize it, that it's like nobody's ever asked civilian combatant ratio. What do you mean? You're telling the country where it can't go to get its own hostages, American citizens, back. But I understand that all war is politics. This famous dead Prussian guy, war is politics by other means.
That would be Bismarck, I'm guessing.
Clausewitz.
No.
Close.
Same era, right? Two more questions about, I guess, urban warfare, and then I do want to talk about some of the geopolitical things that are happening in the Middle East. A lot of questions about that. I guess one question is, I think you said in an article that whatever the Geneva Convention says, Hamas does the exact opposite, something to that effect.
Yeah.
And how does the Geneva Convention need to be modified or changed in some way to reflect the fact that so many wars are state actors versus non-state terrorist actors?
Yeah, I've gotten this a lot. And by Geneva Conventions, I think you mean just the body of law.
International.
Yeah, international law. Actually, I call it the law of armed conflict. There's a reason why people call it the international humanitarian law, because humanitarian law is not the law of war, but they want it to be. They'll use IHL, and Europe uses IHL a lot. I do not believe that it needs to change. The Enforced Geneva Convention was a positive. We shouldn't target civilians to get the other side to do what we want in a battle of will. But the law actually accounts for non-state actors. You can have an internationally armed conflict between two nations, or you can have a non-internationally armed conflict involving non-state actors. The law is very clear. What I would dream of is that people would just understand what the law says and not make up crap that it doesn't. Sorry for my French. And you have that too, that you have Amnesty International, horrible at telling people what the law of war says. ICC, ICJ, United Nations, generals, like you're making up stuff now. If the law doesn't say anything about that, like we don't even need to go into like what does the law say about who's conducting genocide and who is not. But they're like proportionality, necessity, like all that. Like I want people to understand the law. I do not think we need new laws. The law is very clear and accounts for non-state actors. Yes, we the international world created Hamas. Hamas is called the liberal dilemma. You follow the law. I do not. Doesn't matter. You still need to follow the law of war. So why did they weaponize and turn every hospital, and to include today, it's still happening. And I was just with the unit in Jabalia. They turn every hospital. That's where they seek refuge to do the military operations because it's protected. And in the international community, the court of public opinion said, look at them attacking our hospital. Like, I had some guy arguing that Israel had bombed every hospital. And I had to double check with them. Have you guys bombed any? Not one. But there's this guy, professor in some big college, saying that they bombed every one of them. No, Hamas is in every one of them. Has there been battles like in the Al-Shifa battle? Yes. I just need people to understand what the law says, and I want political leaders to have somebody tell them what the law says. And you could say, like, that media report, it's not what the law says.
Okay. One more question about urban warfare. When it comes to technological breakthroughs for urban warfare, like drones,
Yeah.
what is the next frontier of innovation in your opinion? And if not, if we don't know what should be the next frontier, and where should we be investing?
Interesting. That's why I was studying Israel for a long time, because Israel is the most prepared military in the world for this type of urban warfare. Contested, dense urban areas where the defender knows you're coming. And I was telling, to include the United Nations, like, don't take their bombs. If you want to reduce civilian harms, give them a bulldozer. So the IDF we were talking about it, the D9 bulldozers, 3-story tall, armorized bulldozer that the U.S. military doesn't even have. And they have 20 per brigade. Because they enter that urban area with the bulldozer in the lead and then a tank behind it. Because it will take the fire of the defender, it will take the explosives in the ground, because there's an explosive in every other house. That's actually, I wish more people would have more bulldozers. Yes, drones, and I was studying that as well. Even the IDF found itself wanting of drones, because they weren't prepared for this scale of an operation. Israel's never fought a war this long, and never attempted an operation like this where they're clearing dense urban terrain. Every building, every tunnel. There's 6,000 tunnel shafts that they've found. There's 300 miles that they've run out. They have to figure out how to destroy the tunnels, which maybe we can talk about. The drones they went into, tactical drones without any, but units, again, using the creativity of Israel, they've developed things like facial recognition sensors where they can surround areas in common units and tell the civilians to evacuate through them, and then use the facial recognition to pick all the Hamas out of the crowd without firing a single shot. Actually, there was a hospital in southern Gaza that they surrounded. It's called a call-out. And they evacuated everybody, and they said, you know how we knew who the Hamas were? One, the facial recognition, but it was all the ones in the wheelchairs carrying babies. But and then they had drones. So they started off with 0 drones, and I talked to the 55th Brigade, they had 250 drones, where they're not entering a space, turning a corner, nothing without a drone. We all saw that's how they got Yahya Sinwar, because they had developed the technology where they want to go look at something, they don't send a soldier, they send a drone. And then they bring in the fire on top of it. So the bulldozer, the drone, the facial recognition, this is where I'm trying to say, outside of fighting the lives, that like in the past, Israel's lessons learned will save American lives on the next battlefield. And that's what happened after the Yom Kippur War. We sent 27 different studies of the U.S. military of how did Israel do it? How did they survive the Yom Kippur War and have a success? It changed all of our weapons, our fighting doctrine. I'm arguing the same thing for what Israel's been able to do in Gaza against odds and challenges nobody has faced. It's like those lessons from how they use freeze-dried plasma and whole blood and bring ICU beds out to the soldiers. They will save American soldiers' lives on the next battlefield.
Okay, so a couple of geopolitical questions. This is a little bit of a combo, but you mentioned tunnels.
Yeah.
Both in Gaza and in Lebanon, the Hezbollah tunnels. How much in each area has Israel destroyed? And when Israel destroys a tunnel, do they seal them up, blow them up? How easy would it be for Hamas and Hezbollah to reconstruct tunnel architecture if Israel didn't stop them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wrote a paper for the Modern War Institute about the tunnels, like I think I mentioned in my talk, which is like a year's worth of research, because at first the IDF, they had the Yahalom unit, which again, Israel was the most prepared for tunnels of any military in the world, because they had a whole brigade of special forces engineers called the Yahalom or Weasels that were prepared to to go into tunnels, clear them, everything. Hamas were fighting from the tunnels and just had them all booby-trapped. They actually poured the concrete with the bombs in the wall. So and then all they had to do is prime them and they could leave all the tunnels booby-trapped. Israel tried to flood them, which was creative. They brought in 5 industrial level pumps and they could these pumps could fill an Olympic swimming pool in 7 minutes. And they just started flooding the tunnels, but it didn't work. But then they faced a problem, which people, you asked me the number, because I've gotten it before, and there is no number, but people want a number, and I've seen this, like New York Times say, Israel, after a year and all this destruction, have only destroyed 10% of the tunnels in Gaza. Well, where do you get that number? Like, the IDF don't even know how many total numbers are, because they still haven't discovered all the tunnels to know where to get that ratio. Again, lies, damn lies, and statistics. But Israel faced a strategic challenge in Gaza. We can talk about Lebanon as well, although there is more tunnels in southern Lebanon than there are equal to Gaza. They're just different. You know, there's like a 45 kilometer tunnel, which is part of that supply line from Syria into Lebanon, and there's tunnels all over there. They're different though. They were staging areas more in southern Lebanon than there are a couple. They actually found 2 cross-border tunnels in the north. Israel faced a strategic challenge of how do you destroy a tunnel? You know, the water didn't work because it just emptied out. Really, the only way they can do it is explosive force. But what I'm here to tell you is that Israel doesn't need, in my opinion, to destroy all the tunnels in Gaza to have removed the capability from Hamas. Because they figured out that there's different levels of tunnels. There's like a strategic tunnel, like the massive, which is the tunnel, the picture I showed of this 2-mile long tunnel that went right up to the Israeli wall. But the underground barrier actually worked. But you could drive trucks through it, you could float thousands of soldiers through it. That's a strategic capability. That's an attack capability. You could basically enter northern Gaza around Erez and come out in Rafah at one point. So Israel needed to find all the different levels, strategic, operational, kind of the ones that went underneath the Wadi Gaza. They had 2-mile long tunnels that went underneath this river basin. Anything was possible. They had to destroy those. They're not going to destroy every tunnel that goes between every building because just logically it would destroy all the buildings that are above it. But also there's not enough explosives for that. Like they've had to use like Hamas anti-tank mines and string them along a tunnel, which is dangerous work, to destroy the ones they have. Southern Lebanon, again, we didn't have time. The goal in southern Lebanon is different. There's no goal to destroy Hezbollah as an organization. You can't. It's embedded in the Lebanese society. You're going to invade Beirut? Not logical. It was about pushing them back. It's about clearing them of their vast resource of rockets, which they have, and that buffer. I was in places like Kiryat Shema, terrible names, and you could look into and you could see the Hezbollah position literally from people's house. It's about clearing that, and the tunnels there have been found. Some of those actually do fill with wet cement. The northern tunnels in the north are different because they're solid rock. So to use a bunker buster or explosives, it's a lot different. So some of those that do use wet cement, but it's a big problem. But these people that say that Israel's not been successful at destroying Hamas's military infrastructure is just a lie, because again they use the number of total tunnels.
So, speaking of cement, the next question is, does Israel have the capability to destroy the deeply dug into Iranian nuclear facilities?
So that's an interesting question. I only do open source research.
You haven't been invited to inspect the...
I have not been invited. Israel has a lot of capability that even the Islamic regime in Iran, they like to separate Iran, the people of Iran, from this mullah regime. Some people argue they do. I do not believe that they have the munition type, because you're talking 20,000-pound bombs needed to penetrate to the depth that some of these nuclear bunkers are, that they would need help. And the United States says it doesn't mean that you have to use military pressure, but they need to roll that nuclear program back, because the nuclear-armed Iran is horrible for the world among the Middle East. And in this Islamic regime in Iran, it says they want them for one reason: to destroy Israel. And they have a countdown in central Tehran, it's still running, when they believe they'll succeed in destroying Israel. And then the United States is next, because Israel's the little Satan, the United States is the great Satan. So they're coming next. So the fact that Israel has to even think about striking those nuclear sites, they've already shown that the Islamic regime should not buy any more Russian air defense systems. They don't work. They've shown they can reach in, I'm sure you're asking about Syria, but now there is open airspace over Syria to get to Iran. If I was the Islamic regime, I would be very deterred in what I'm doing. But we also put rational actor, I didn't mention it, but Hamas is not a rational actor. They want to die. The Islamic regime's main goal, like many nations, is survival. So you would think they would be deterred, but there's also been this foreign diplomacy insanity where we, to include recently, the United States try this approach of just giving them money and hoping for a different outcome. That insanity is about to stop.
All right, well, before we get
I didn't answer the question. See, I did that?
someone has 20,000-pound bombs that we could use in
Yes.
in a necessity. So before we get to Syria, the question about the Houthis in Yemen.
Oh.
So since October 7th, they've had the largest global impact from an economic perspective based on the shipping routes. It seemed to receive the least amount of news coverage as well as the least amount of response from the Western coalition in Israel. What's the reason for that in your opinion, and are we taking the right approach with the Houthis?
So I'll start with the ending first. That's easy. No. The U.S. administration took the Houthis off the terror watch list during this administration. I don't do politics. It's a fact. Because they believed in this foreign policy approach of course, those people want their people to eat. So they took them off the watch list so they could bring more humanitarian aid, hoping that the Yemenis would stop the hundreds of thousands of people dying of starvation and give them that aid. Billions of dollars being invested by Iran in the Houthis, who have a arsenal, unlike any military, of shore to sea ballistic and cruise missiles and drones that most militaries don't have. I put up a recent on my X, just a picture of it. It costs international shipping. Most people just won't even go through the Red Sea anymore. Over $200 billion in the last year, and it's been allowed because Israel's had to make a priority of who it's going to deal with, because I guess it's all on Israel to deal with these Islamic regime tentacles of the octopus, which have only been allowed through billions of dollars. I mean, that's what Israel did for Lebanon. It destroyed Hezbollah, and now the Lebanese people have a chance to be free because you don't have billions of dollars and an army rivaling way over the Lebanese military. That's who signed the treaty. Hezbollah didn't sign anything. The Lebanese government and its military signed, like, we'll keep them out of the way.
They did specifically target Hezbollah banks, though, to your point.
Yes, and the money. So the Houthis are, although Israel was attacking today, and Israel was the one who attacked their port, the U.S. military has been defensive against the Houthis. Somebody, hopefully very soon, takes that capability away from the Houthis. And you know who would really love us to do that? Saudi Arabia. Because Saudi Arabia asked for help. Because if you've ever been to Saudi Arabia doesn't have a military. It asked for the United States to help with the Houthi problem. And what did we do? We gave the Houthi money.
The Saudis have an air force, do they not?
They have some bit of air force. They have 2 brigades of military, though. So this is, again, I'm an army guy. You can't win wars by bombing alone. But somebody needs to take that capability. Just for, if you're an American isolationist, $200 billion of international shipping because this terrorist organization is attacking anything that goes through there.
I guess as a follow-up, though, if you can't win by bombing, does that mean you have to have feet on the ground to actually take out the Houthis?
That's a good question. So I said you can't win wars. Nobody's at war with the Houthis. Can you reduce? We just saw what was done to Hezbollah through a combined joint military intelligence operation, dismantle an organization's capabilities. You can't destroy them. You can't destroy the Houthis by air power alone. You sure the heck can take away most of their supplies.
Makes sense. All right, let's talk about Syria. I mean, I don't really have a question here other than, Syria, discuss. There's a lot going on there.
Syria, go! It is the unknown, right? So in the last Syria fell because of Israel's operations. And the Syrian people have been liberated because of Israel's operations against the Islamic regime, against Hezbollah, against all that is keeping Assad in place. Russia wasn't able to come to Assad's aid because of Ukraine. But Hezbollah, who had sent tens of thousands of soldiers to help defend the Assad regime, wasn't able to because, like I showed, they're not doing much behind them. Syria fell, but that doesn't necessarily mean a good thing. It's a change. It did, and then they did cut off. If you're a counter-Islamic regime, which is Shia, to have a Sunni terrorist organization in charge of Syria is a counter to the Islamic regime in Iran. I published a paper about the drug trade. Assad had turned Syria into a narco state. It was already a terrorist state, but now it became a narco state. With Hezbollah. And the Islamic regime in Iran. So there were 5,000 IRGC commanders in Syria that couldn't help Assad. And it fell rapidly, and I've done the discussion of how did it fall so rapidly? What did the Syrian military do? Well, the Syrian military wasn't being paid. There was some insider stuff happening, but it fell rapidly. And now there is a big unknown with lots of people rightfully concerned. Israel, of course, to protect itself, moved into the Syrian Golan Heights, which is the gall of Putin today to say that it is not right that Israel has annexed the Syrian Golan Heights. It's like you can't make this up. Israel has moved and secured, but what Israel did too, again, and the entire Middle East should be thanking it, is Israel bombed all of Assad's military capabilities. His chemical weapons that he used against his own people, his air defense systems, his naval systems, all that was getting ready to fall into a designated terrorist organization by the United States. That's who seized power. Al-Qaeda seized power in Syria. They changed their names and they align with ISIS. It's Al-Qaeda. If there's a terrorist saying he's a moderate, just wait. Syria, Israel bombed with over 300 air sorties, everything that the Syrian military had, so it wouldn't fall into terrorist hands, and the Middle East should be thanking them for that. So we don't know what's going to happen at this point. Jordan's very concerned, already was weakened. Other places are very concerned about what's going to happen. The HTS, which is the organization that seized power where Assad used to have power, although there's the Turkish vote, there's the Russian vote, Russia still has a port in Syria. Everybody is vying for influence over the new regime. Although they're like the Taliban, they say they don't want the drug trade, which was producing billions of dollars more than the GDP of Syria. It's what's going to happen and what the United States, hopefully, in my personal opinion, if no affiliation, doesn't recognize this terrorist organization's right over Syria. But there's a lot happening. There's conferences 2 days ago. Turkey's making its move, trying to take control of the northern part of Syria. Russia still wants a vote. Iran wants a vote, but it's weaker now. The Islamic regime in Iran, who had been allowed to gain all this power, is weaker than it's been in decades. And Israel is stronger than it's been in a very long time.
All right, so to not get in trouble with Rabbi Yossi, I think we'll make this the last question for time constraints, because we could go on for a long time. But I guess if we all could show up for work tomorrow morning and someone asks us a question about the IDF, about Gaza, what's the biggest takeaway that you think you can share today that can help us in our conversations tomorrow?
I mean, I think the one that recognizes that Hamas deploys a human sacrifice strategy. That if you want to point the finger at cause of civilian death in Gaza, you better point it at Hamas. And everything they've acted, everything they've done, everything they've said, is that to get their people killed. Everything the IDF have done is to protect civilians. What it's doing daily to feed, medical aid, house, everything, it's so abnormal. If you're having a conversation and you're not getting anywhere, I don't get flippant, but the IDF are succeeding. The IDF are winning. They clearly won against Hezbollah. They're winning against Hamas. I'm not saying they're ultimately going to win, but they're winning. And all of these terrorist organizations who do not have, this is the other problem which I didn't talk about, you're going to argue with somebody who doesn't know the area, is that recognizing, and hopefully they can recognize that they're imposing their values on another organization. The one thing that Hamas has never said is that they want a two-state solution. They've never said is they want to live side by side in harmony with the Jewish people. They've never said, I just want equal rights for my women and my children. And I want prosperity. Hamas has never said these things, but we, not me, the collective, the vocal minority believes that they say these things. You know, gays for Palestine. It's insanity, but literally we have this problem where we impose our values because we believe they're oppressed. Like they've never said those things, and they would kill you on sight. Wow.
Yeah. I think IDF's on our side. Well, let's all thank John for
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, David. Thank you. And everyone should follow John on X if you're on X. He posts a lot. And thank you all for being here. Thank you again, John. Please stick around, have some tea, coffee, and hope to see you guys again at the next fantastic event at the LCC.